Do you think there may be just a bit too much ego out there, that there are people who think they can do no wrong, that morality doesn't apply to them? And I'm not talking about politicians and lawyers or film directors. Just in time for episode 29 of Pop Art, the podcast where my guest chooses a movie from popular culture, and I'll select a film from the more art classic side of cinema with a connection to it. I am your It's Alive host, Howard Kasner. For my listeners, please like, follow, or comment. I'm especially looking for more reviews on iTunes, and I'd love to know what you think. Today, my guest is blogger and film enthusiast Curt Headly, who has chosen the Steven Spielberg blockbuster with game-changing special effects, Jurassic Park, while I have chosen the timeless horror classics, a set of three, Frankenstein, Bride of Frankenstein, and Son of Frankenstein, all films about scientists trying to play God. To begin, Curt, why don't you tell us something about yourself?
As Howard so eloquently put it, I am Curt, also known as the Hyperson 55 in most of my areas. I am a freelance illustrator and aspiring animator. I'm a big fan of films, TV, and video games. Film is just everything to me. I have a good time with it. That's pretty much the best way to summarize me in not so many words.
Oh, that's great. Well, with that, let's get to your selection, Jurassic Park. First, some information about the film. Jurassic Park was released in 1993. It was directed by Steven Spielberg and written by Michael Crichton and David Cope, based on the book by Crichton. It stars Sam Neill, Laura Dern, Jeff Goldblum, Richard Attenborough, Bob Peck, Joseph Mazzello, Ariana Richards, Samuel L. Jackson, B.D. Wong, Cameron Thor, and Wayne Knight. The basic premise revolves around an entrepreneur who has backed a group of scientists that have discovered a way to clone dinosaurs. He has already begun the creation of a theme park on a remote island, but when a worker is killed by one of their creations, the insurance company won't back the park unless two scientists sign off on it. Enter a trio of scientists, as well as the entrepreneur's two grandchildren, to look over the island, but their inspection goes disastrously wrong, and everyone's life ends up in danger. Why did you choose this film?
Well, Jurassic Park, like a lot of children who grew up in the 90s, is one of the classics of my generation. I remember coming across it when I was about maybe 4 or 5 years old, because my parents already had it on VHS, and it was one of those films that was just scary enough that they didn't allow me to watch it unless they were around. I tried to sneak that film many a time and failed. This film has stuck with me since my childhood, and every time I watch it, there are certain things about this film that not only nostalgically work for me, but just on a technical and just entertainment level always excites me. Several key moments in the film, whether it's the introduction when you have the guys like loading the raptor, or the scene with the children stealthily moving around in the kitchen away from the raptors, or the first time the T-Rex gets out and starts walking amongst the cars. Those classic scenes and the way in which they're crafted, directed, have that tension build up, and the use of music as well, of course. Everything coalesces in a way that feels so magical and spectacular. Fantastical, yeah.
Well, when did you manage to see it? You said that you kept trying to see it, but your parents seem to always outfox you.
Criminy. This is a little tricky because there's a lot of people that tend to remember their very first time watching films. My memory of watching films is a little hazy. The first major film I remember seeing in the cinema was the 1996 live action version of Pinocchio. And before that, there was a lot of films that I saw on VHS or on TV with my dad, who was the main person who showed me films. Trying to remember those dates specifically is a little tricky, but I do recall, I'd say about maybe age 5.
And what did you think about it upon seeing it again recently?
Jurassic Park is one of those films I come back to every few years. I ended up watching this with my sister because she hasn't seen it for a while. The thing about Jurassic Park for me is it almost has that same feeling of seeing it for the first time. And that's what entices me to watch it every time. I know the scenes backwards and forwards. I know the dialogue. I know what's coming. And yet there's still a part of me that turns into a little child that saw these things for the first time. The appearance of the dinosaurs, the build up to them, but also the conversations that the people are having in between, which always has me more intrigued than I ever was, because as a child, I was always just looking at the spectacle and action than anything else. But with the conversations about playing God, whether these creatures should exist or not, and the science behind what brought them to life, those parts of the conversation have become more intriguing to me as an adult than they were many years ago.
I'm glad to hear you say that, because we'll definitely be talking about that in both films, because I think they both address those issues, though sometimes those issues may be getting a little lost for various reasons. I saw it when it first came out. I enjoyed it very, very much. There are a lot of things I do like about it. There are certain things that I have issues with, and we can get into that. Though I did have one interesting reaction to it, and I wasn't the only one. There were a couple of reviewers who also said something like this, and I think Pauline Kael might have been one of them. These special effects were too good. They were so seamless that they actually made it seem a bit unreal instead of realistic. And that's a very odd reaction to have, but it was the first time that we had special effects that were this seamless. I don't really have that feeling anymore when I watch sci-fi films that use computer-generated special effects. I don't think, oh, well, it's too perfect, but it was kind of unnerving at the time.
That is a very interesting perspective. Now that you say it, it does kind of make sense, especially as a child. There's certain ways that you look at visual effects and live action. It's harder to distinguish the difference. When my dad showed me Jason and the Argonauts when I was about maybe 6 or so years old, my dad always used to go on about how when he saw this when he was younger, he thought these were some of the most amazing special effects ever. And as a child, I didn't think too much about the fact that this was stop motion, but it still looked really impressive to me. Looking at the difference between that and Jurassic Park at the time, I could tell that this was on a whole new level. The use of practical effects with CGI and the way in which they used lighting to perfectly blend all that stuff together. I would have assumed that dinosaurs were real, and it scared the living daylights out of me as a child, but I also thought it was bloody brilliant.
Yeah, it was. And I'm sort of with your father. One of my earliest films, especially filled with special effects, would be Jason of the Argonauts. And when you were a child, that was a very, very impressive movie, along with movies like King Kong. They all had these incredible stop motion special effects that were state of the art. Today, CGI is just the way to go. What are some of your favorite scenes in the movie?
There's numerous, but I will not bore you with, the specifics. Otherwise, we'll be here for the rest of time. I would say the introduction scene has always stood out to me, even as a kid. Again, it was the brilliance of the tension and suspense. You have all these men standing there with their helmets looking at something that we don't know what it is. They've got this big crate that's being lowered into the area. What's in there? What's so dangerous? No one can see what it is. Then you have the man who's meant to open up the gate, and literally the raptor comes along, knocks him down, and he's getting pulled in there, and everyone's using their little electric cattle prod to try and stop the beast. I remember that scene so much. All of my friends and even my sister, most times when we talk about Jurassic Park, we'll talk about our favorite lines. A lot of people will refer to the line "shoot her." It's that feeling of fear and not knowing what it is, being intense and crazy. And as a kid, it terrified me.
Well, it's interesting. No one had really heard of raptors before. They only appear at the very end. Yes, it is. Once the movie was over, they're the only dinosaurs that anybody was talking about.
Oh, yes. I can totally understand that. Another scene that obviously a lot of people loved was the part with the children in the kitchen with the raptors. That first scene where you see the raptor opening that door, poking his head in, and then you find that it's not just one, but 2 of them after these children. Films that show children in danger, that stuff resonates with children a lot more. As a child, I was terrified every time I saw that, even though I knew the kids made it through. The fact that they had to be so careful with sound, literally one wrong move could get you eaten, and then one of the ladle falls. Oh gosh, one of the bits that terrified me the most was when Timmy was headed into the freezer. He slips and so does the raptor, and somehow he's able to cop his way out of there and get the door closed. I would have died at least 3 times in that scenario.
Well, I certainly agree with you. That's on my list. Then you have the Deus Ex Machina ending with the T-Rex getting one of the raptors. Steven Spielberg said that he thought the audience would be disappointed if the T-Rex didn't at least make one more appearance. So he used him at the end to help resolve the situation. One of my favorite ones, of course, is one that everybody remembers. It was perhaps the wittiest or the funniest scene when they're in the cars and the T-Rex is coming for them. They go to the rear view mirror. What does it say? Objects in the mirror appear closer than they really are. The audience lost it.
Absolutely. Again, one of those scenes that's terrifying but also has nice moments of humor sprinkled in. Obviously, you have Ian Malcolm, one of the most interesting characters, very witty, very chatty, sometimes speaking inappropriately in situations that really don't need it.
It's interesting that you talk about the thematic ideas.
Yeah.
of this movie, which contend with science and what science can do or should do and what they are able to do. I think it's Jeff Goldblum's character who says something to the effect, scientists have been so busy saying what they could do, they never stop to think about whether they should do it. That has been one of the biggest conflicts, and we'll get into more of this with the Frankenstein movies, of modernism, which was the period that followed the Enlightenment and came before existentialism, where scientists began to think they can do anything, there is no morality. Science is so pure that they really can't do anything wrong. One of the interesting things I found about this movie is the reason why they have to bring these scientists here is not because the scientists want people to come in to make sure everything is okay. They don't care. They think they've done it, it's fine. They don't need any oversight. It's the insurance company who has said, wait a minute, no matter what you think, you're going to be liable if something goes wrong. And I once read a book on science and morality. There was one section where some scientists were starting to set up some sort of medical experiment. They were talking about the protocols, the parameters of what they could do. And the scientists basically said, well, we're scientists. We can do anything we want. There is no such thing as morality. Science is neither good nor bad. Then the lawyer who was in the room said, well, whether that's true or not, you can still be sued. Then all of a sudden the scientist said, well, maybe we do need to set up some protocols. So it wasn't even the morality of the situation that got them to thinking about the right and wrong of it. It was the lawyer saying, you can be sued. And it's the same thing here. It wasn't the scientist. It was the insurance company saying, if you want us to cover you, you're going to have to do a lot more to convince us that this is safe.
Yeah, definitely. I found the lawyer character way more interesting in the last couple years that I've seen this film, especially when the film was re-released in 3D, actually, and I got to see it in the cinema for the first time. I found myself paying attention to those conversations between the lawyer and the first archaeologist man when he came along. Then obviously his conversation with John Hammond and then everybody else afterwards. It's always been interesting thinking about financial elements that come into this. And obviously, if anything goes wrong, John Hammond and his whole park could just be shut down by this outside group. Wow, there's a lot more compelling material here that's lost on certain individuals because they're not really paying attention to that. They're sort of just looking forward to the spectacle more so than anything else.
It will also be the same in the Frankenstein movies, where the genre elements, that this is a thriller fantasy type movie. The others are horror movies, that genre so overwhelms the story that yes, the ideas and the philosophy do get lost. Even if you bring it up sometimes to people, they'll go, oh, who cares about that? I'm just here to be entertained. But you're right, there is actually a lot more going on here.
Yeah. One of the key scenes that I've always loved but appreciate now because I fully understand it is the scene where everybody's at the table having their food, but then the paleontologist and Ian Malcolm start to question the island and its safety. Ian Malcolm goes on his monologue about whether scientists should play God. One of my favorite lines is, before you even knew what you had, you patented, packaged it, and slapped it on a plastic lunchbox, and then he's selling it. And I'm just like, oh man, it's really good.
As he says, scientists were more focused on what they could do rather than on what they should do. At the same time, when this movie was made, and even before this idea of scientists playing God, and because they play God, they have to be punished, was being ridiculed. It was considered a cliche, it was considered a trope.
Right.
But the metaphor, I think, still has merit. Just because you're a scientist doesn't mean that you don't have a responsibility toward morality, that there aren't ideas of right and wrong that have to be taken into consideration. With Jurassic Park, they just thought, if we build it, nothing's going to go wrong because we're scientists. And that's not really the way life works.
Oh, no. There's a lot of logistical things that you have to think about when bringing these creatures into play. I think it's even mentioned in the film that the dinosaurs have essentially existed at a point in time far before we even came into existence. So who's to say how they react to our current ecosystem? I feel like the scientists and a lot of the people in this film were treating them like zoo animals, but they're a lot more dangerous. We don't know how they react, especially with additional people, because they haven't come across people before. Again, there's just a whole lot of minor details that wouldn't fly in real life. There'd be a lot more regulation, a lot more this, that, and the other that you'd have to cover before you'd even get this place off the ground.
Yes. The Jeff Goldblum character brings up a couple of other additional issues. And one is the chaos theory, which of course not everybody believes in, but the idea that a butterfly flapping its wing in China can contribute to a tsunami across the planet, that you don't know what's going to happen, that you don't know what can actually interfere. The other thing he says is that nature will find a way. Just because you think you've set it up where they can't reproduce doesn't mean that that's necessarily the way it's going to happen. And in some ways, I look at those as somewhat silly ideas, but even from a metaphorical perspective, that you can't really predict the future. You can't know everything. That aspect of it, yes, that's going to cause problems.
Yeah, the whole line of life finds a way. There are certain things in life that as much as you try to prepare or have as much foresight as possible, something could go wrong, something could change, but that throws a spanner in the works. It's just one of those things where the future, as fun as it is, can also be very unpredictable. It can also be a little chaotic or crazy. There is always a potential chance for a variable that no one considered.
Another aspect of the story, and this is one of the areas where, though I very much enjoy Jurassic Park and I have a very good time with it, the main issue I have with it are the characters, which I find to be a bit flat. The big exception is Jeff Goldblum. The reason why his character works so well is that he's playing Jeff Goldblum. Jeff Goldblum is such a great character. I almost want to say have him in every movie.
Yeah.
The other two, Laura Dern's character and Sam Neill's, I just found rather flat and interesting. In the attempt by the writers to give the characters depth, what they gave them, I don't think really works that well. Laura Dern is a scientist, but she's a woman. Well, since she's a woman, her main issue has to be whether she wants to have children or not. So I found that a very reductive look at that character as it is. Then Sam Neill's character has to learn that he actually likes children and can be a good father. And my thought is, all these people had to die just so Sam Neill can learn to be a good father. That also seemed a little off. Almost everybody else's character I found to be much more interesting.
That's fair. As a child, obviously, you don't really pay attention to those details. It's just people with faces that you see who are either going to live or die. This was primarily my introduction to most of these actors, so I've obviously latched onto them in a way that makes these people synonymous in my memories of people I like. As a child, I guess I gravitated towards Ian Malcolm because I found him funny and he got into most of the crazy situations. Obviously, there's the children as well because I related to them because I was a child. Even people like Dennis being all sneaky trying to get the dinosaur embryos, or Sam Jackson being the dude working on the computers and stuff. I found those guys pretty interesting because they had memorable scenes, quotes, and interactions with some of the other people. With time, as I got older, I started to notice the problem with characters because as I got older and started learning about film in college, there was certain things about characters and depth that I started to learn about, and I was looking back at these characters. At the end of the day, looking at them now, there's not really much to them. I still like them because the actors who were in those roles put in a good performance, so I guess I could forgive the lack of depth to them.
And I think that's what separates Laura Dern and Sam Neill from the rest. Laura Dern and Sam Neill are very good actors, but they're not character actors.
Right.
And if they're not giving characters to play, there's often not a lot they can do. All the others are character actors. And if you don't give them enough to do, they just play their characters. That's what's wonderful about character actors.
Yeah, no, definitely. I've found, at least with the sequels and the newer Jurassic World films, even though these characters in the first film, save for a couple, don't have as much depth as I would like, at least some of their characterization has been more pleasant to be in the company of. With the newer films, that with each new entry, the characters have become less likable, less believable, and potentially more tedious and annoying than anything else.
I don't think we can conclude talking about this without talking about John Williams.
Oh, yes.
He is my second favorite screen composer of all time. I've been able to let go of Bernard Herrmann as my favorite. John Williams brings so much to a film that he can really help you ignore perhaps some of the faults of the movie at times. Dear, he has a marvelous score. When they're going through the park and Sam Neill and Laura Dern first see them and you see the expression on their faces, I'm not remotely convinced that scene would work anywhere near as well as it does without that incredible John Williams score.
Oh, absolutely. This is one of my all-time favorite film scores ever. It's incredibly memorable. It elevates everything that's happening on screen by 100. whether it be wonder, whimsical, magical feelings, or feelings of tension and suspense, or just all out fear, craziness. He has a piece of music that will work for every scene. One of my favorite points in the movie is actually when Dennis goes on his little mission to steal the dinosaur embryos. That sort of sneaky music as it's going along, it has a thriller slash heist element to it, and that's one of those themes that stuck with me even as much as some of the more sweeping material at the start of the film when they get to the park, or when you have everybody escaping on the helicopters. You see they're either pterodactyls or pterodons, I think. I can't remember my dinosaur specific names. The music resonates in the soul in a way that not many other scores can.
This is off subject. I've been getting involved with BBC game shows. Game show Pointless. One time they had pictures of 5 dinosaurs with every other letter missing. And of course, they had obvious ones to really obscure ones. They got to one person who said, "Ever since my son saw Jurassic Park, he is nothing but being about dinosaurs." So this guy was able to name the least known dinosaur.
Wow, that is really impressive.
This film was responsible for a huge, not just interest in dinosaurs, but people entering the paleontology field. There was like a 15% increase when it came to going to college. It had that sort of effect on the audience. Even though most of these dinosaurs in here didn't even exist at the same time, most of them I don't think even existed during the Jurassic period. It just opened up this whole new world.
Absolutely. I know that most people that grew up with this film, we all became obsessed with dinosaurs in a way that I don't think I'd ever seen before. Most people I knew were all running out to libraries trying to read up about dinosaurs. Anytime that there was any new film that featured dinosaurs or a TV program that had it, there was just an obsession about it. Loads of people talking about how they love T-Rexes or Stegosaurus, Triceratops, and all that kind of stuff. The film really set a fire in the hearts of a lot of children.
Before moving on, I did want to go back. We did talk about the special effects, but I did want to say that the computer-generated imagery was by Industrial Light and Magic, and the animatronics was mainly by Stan Winston. Originally, they were going to go with animatronic, and then people convinced Spielberg to go with computer-generated imagery. Stan Winston thought, "Oh, I'm out of a job. This is going to be it." But in the end, they did have to use Stan Winston because all the close-ups and when they actually interacted with the dinosaurs were animatronics by.
Yeah, it's incredible seeing how this film got to where it was, and when you look up the production behind it. I love Stan Winston's work. I've seen it in numerous different places. I was mainly familiar with his stuff in The Terminator, because that was another film that my dad showed me when I was younger. The use of practical effects was so well crafted in this film due to just the choices of camera positioning, lighting, especially the scenes at night with the T-Rex. Hearing that the T-Rex almost fell apart, but they were still able to, salvage it and make the film work under such crazy weather conditions really blows the mind for me. And I always imagined, after hearing about what this film could have been without these special effects, what it would have looked like if they had gone with animatronics or claymation before that.
It just wouldn't have been quite the same. This was a trendsetter. This changed the way movies were made from a technical point of view.
Industrial Light and Magic had already been pretty notable because of their work on the Star Wars franchise, but this was one of those films that really helped cement them as the most notable special effects people in the game. Obviously now you have people like Double Negative, Digital Domain, Weta Digital making their marks on several different films. Industrial Light and Magic for me is at that peak of visual effect material.
With that, here's some more information about the movie. On a budget of $63 million, Jurassic Park made a profit of $1.033 billion. And this was the #1 grossing film that year, but also was the #1 grossing film until Titanic. The most difficult effect to pull off was the ripples on the water in the glass when the T-Rex is approaching. And they finally figured out how to do that by plucking guitar strings. Spielberg wanted the movie to be the first with digital sound. The film was marketed with the tagline, "An adventure 65 million years in the making." And Jurassic Park won all 3 Academy Awards for which it was nominated: Best Sound Editing, Best Sound Mixing, and Best Visual Effects. With that, let's go to my selection, and that is the Frankenstein trilogy. Frankenstein, Bride of Frankenstein, and Son of Frankenstein. First, some information about the films, and bear with me because we're doing 3 films here. Frankenstein was released in 1931. It was directed by James Whale. It was adapted from a 1927 play by Peggy Webling, which was in turn adapted from Mary Shelley's 1818 novel, Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus. The screenplay is by Francis Edward Farrago. It stars Boris Karloff, Colin Clive, Mae Clark, John Bowles, Edward Van Sloan, Dwight Fry, Lionel Belmore, and Mary Lynn Harris. The Bride of Frankenstein was released in 1935. It was also directed by James Whale. The screenplay is by William Hurlbut, suggested by characters created by Mary Shelley. It stars Boris Karloff, Colin Clive, Valerie Hobson, Ernest Thesiger, Elsa Lanchester, Gavin Gordon, Douglas Walton, Una O'Connor, E. E. Clive, O.P. Heggie, and Dwight Fry. Son of Frankenstein was released in 1939. It was directed by Roland V. Lee and written by Willis Cooper, and it stars Basil Rathbone, Boris Karloff, Bela Lugosi, Lionel Atwill, Josephine Hutchinson, Emma Dunn, and Ward Bond. The basic premise of the movies begins with Frankenstein. Baron von Frankenstein, who has more or less abandoned his fiancée and father in a scientific quest to create life from a dead body. But when he succeeds, things go wrong and the monster escapes and wreaks havoc on the village until they band together and kill him. The Bride of Frankenstein begins immediately afterward, with everyone thinking the monster is dead, though he isn't. When an ex-teacher of Frankenstein shows up wanting to create human life as Frankenstein has, he coerces Frankenstein into helping him. They create a bride for the monster, but when the bride rejects the monster destroys everyone and everything after allowing Frankenstein and his bride to flee to safety. In Son of Frankenstein, Frankenstein's adult son and family return to the home estate, greeted by hostile villagers. Again, the monster is still alive, but is dying. Frankenstein's old assistant, Igor, convinces the son of Frankenstein to save the monster, but again havoc and death ensue. What do you think of the pairing of the films?
When you suggested these initially, I could see certain parallels, but I wasn't too sure. But after seeing this trilogy all in one go, I can definitely see the comparisons. I can definitely see the whole concept of scientists who want to push the envelope, see how far they can take their experiments. I would say, in not so many words, spit in the face of life and defy the laws of nature.
When did you first see the films?
Very recently, yesterday, in fact.
That's fair. That's a lot of people do. What did you think when you saw them?
As someone who has never really gotten into horror films, but has been aware of these classic ones for many years now, because obviously there's been many adaptations of a lot of these classic movie monsters, I was aware of the actors involved, how notable they were for changing the industry or becoming the standard for which certain other sequels and reboots would adapt from. I thought they were all pretty good. One of the things that really stood out to me was the way in which these films were framed and the lighting involved. Lighting played such an important role and was one of the most compelling aspects for me, especially in these scenes where something suspenseful or scary is happening. The way in which these characters are lit, long shadows that they draw in the background is just really fantastic. It was really compelling stuff, especially Bride of Frankenstein.
I certainly have to agree with you. The look of the films, the light, the shadow, the camera angles, the expressionistic view of it is one of the strongest aspects that still works very well today. I can't remember exactly when I saw them. I would have seen them at some point in my youth on Saturday afternoon when the local television stations would show old movies. They would mainly show monster movies and sci-fi movies. So somewhere along the line, I managed to see all of them at some point. And then over the years, I've revisited them and seen them a few times. I would say that I've probably seen them either 3 or 4 times each. There's so much that I do still like about them. I think a lot of people might feel they are a little bit dated in some ways. And to some degree, you have to put yourself back in that time. See the movies the way the audience would have seen them then. What are some of your favorite scenes in the movie?
I would say one of the scenes that really stood out to me was actually the beginning of The Bride of Frankenstein, because we pick up right where the last film ended. The windmill was set on fire. Everything's concave. You have the angry mob now being reassured by that one, I guess he's a policeman or some sort of enforcement man, where everything's done, the monster's dead. You have that one woman who believes that it's everything sorted, I'm not so sure. You have the couple whose daughter died. The man comes back just to look over things, but then he falls into an open bit of debris into like a well underneath. Frankenstein's just there and he kills him and then works his way back out of the cave into the public again. I found that to be one of the most compelling introductions to any film I've seen for a while, because there have been films that have taken place after the events of the previous one. But for it to have such a notable introduction where things were concluded, that there was, I guess, a certain level of reassurance nothing was happening, and then for the monster to still be alive, to take someone out, and then go straight back into the film, that was very compelling for me.
One of my favorite scenes, and the scenes that I remember most, of course, is the death of Maria, the little girl.
Oh, gosh, yeah.
That's always something that is very haunting, though it was actually eventually cut from the original for censorship reasons. Even though this was pre-code and they got away with a lot more things because this was 1931, the death of Maria was just deemed too disturbing. So some people might see the movie and not really know how she died. Eventually, the scene was found and was put back in, but it still is a very, very haunting scene.
Oh, yeah, I would definitely agree with that. Because when Frankenstein is wandering about in the wilderness and he comes across Maria and they're just hanging out, picking flowers and putting them on the water, I was, oh, okay, so this is showing that the monster is capable of at least compassion or understanding. He's not this crazy brute running around killing people. But then you can see that he just got a little overexcited. And as he picked her up and then just threw her, I was just like, oh, God.
Yes.
I could only imagine what it would have been like to see that during that time period. Yeah, that would have left an image in your mind for a while, long after the film had ended.
In getting back to Jurassic Park and the idea of men playing God or scientists thinking they have no morality, it might be interesting to take a step here and talk about the philosophy of the times and leading up to it. When the book was written in 1818 by Mary Shelley, it was still the Age of Enlightenment, and the Age of Enlightenment was a period of time when the intellectual elite said that we no longer need God to explain things. Most of them still believe that God existed, but science could explain everything. The origins of the world, why we exist, nature.
Right.
But this led to egotism. Mary Shelley, and I read this in a book, she wrote this when she was with her husband, Shelley, and Lord Byron in Switzerland. She saw something in Lord Byron, as well as in her husband, that she didn't like. She saw this incredible egotism and narcissism and this feeling that they were above everybody else, that they didn't necessarily have to obey the moral standards of the time. She wasn't sure where this was going to lead. So she wrote this book, Frankenstein, the Modern Prometheus. And in many ways, her fears came true because the Age of Enlightenment was then replaced by the Age of Modernism. Modernism took Enlightenment one step further. It said that now that we know that science can explain everything, science can create a perfect world. We can solve all man's problems. We can create a utopia. Right and wrong doesn't necessarily apply to us because science is a pure science. There is no morality when it comes to science. The problem is we reached a point where a series of events happened, and that was World War I, the Great Depression, the rise of communism, Nazism, fascism, World War II, and the Holocaust, and it all ended with the atomic bomb. At that point, modernism was cut to ribbons. Nobody in their right mind believed that modernism was now the way to go. The philosophy then was replaced by existentialism, which was replaced by postmodernism. Jurassic Park was a movie that was created during a period of postmodernism, where the movies were created during a time of modernism, as modernism was about to completely fall apart. So here we have this series of films that are basically an attack on the predominant philosophy of the day. This is like Jurassic Park because they're horror films. The ideas behind them are getting lost.
Right, I see. That was a whole lot of interesting information that I wasn't entirely aware of. In that context, it definitely gives you a lot more to think about. I would say one of the interesting things for me was looking at Frankenstein, but also looking at John Hammond as characters who I could definitely see some parallels in. While I feel Frankenstein was a little bit more excited, possibly a more unhinged level about the possibilities of what he could do, what he could create, pushing aside anybody who would get in his way. I could definitely see with John Hammond, there's that one period where he's having that conversation with Ellie in the dining room. He's talking about how he had the flea circus, but he wanted to obviously take it one step further, create something more tangible that people could touch, something that was real, something that they knew wasn't an illusion. And I could look at Frankenstein and see that same aspirations to create something that would wow people, that no one else has done before.
And he didn't think that there was anything right or wrong in what he did. But of course, things go wrong. They go wrong differently in the movie than they do in the book. In the movie, Frankenstein's assistant steals the wrong kind of brain, the brain of a madman. In the book, the monster comes very close to being a human being. He can almost pass. And one of the problems in the book is that the monster is upset about being created. There's something missing. The movie is more a metaphor of raising up children. You can raise them, eventually you can't control them.
Right.
Even nowadays, one of the themes, as more and more people are creating shows and stories about creating artificial intelligence, thinking we'll be able to control them because they're not really real people.
Yeah.
But like the monster or even the dinosaurs.
Yeah, it's one of those things that really makes you think about the consequences before the action. Obviously, these characters, they're more interested in what can and can't be done, as opposed to the potential risk, potential pain that they could be causing, not only the people close to them, but other people as well. But watching these films, whether it be monsters or AI, there's always that point where I think as an audience member, you think, okay, but what if this, that, and the other? You have maybe a small bullet points of things that may potentially be wrong. These people never seem to have those bases covered, especially in the case of the Frankenstein movies, especially when you get to Son of Frankenstein. He knows of what happened to his father. He knows what his creation did, and yet he goes back and does the same thing after a while and then repeats the process. How have we not learned?
Yes, and that's something that's often covered in the great tragedies. No matter how much knowledge we have, we still will make the same mistakes over and over again, fully knowing what has gone wrong before and what can go wrong now. I also think that in the third one, the Son of Frankenstein, there's an additional issue here, but so far I've never seen anybody else raise this issue, but it still connects to this philosophy of moving from the Enlightenment to modernism. This is 1939. The war has not yet started. Germany won't invade Poland until September. But everybody knew that war was on the horizon. Everybody knew what was happening in Germany. The films at the time could not address the issue, at least not directly. They could not go after Germany. They could not go after Nazism because the German film market was just too important. So they weren't about to offend a country and take the chance of them refusing to show the movie. So to some degree, I think we have a metaphor for the rise of Nazism. And I don't think it's just in the theme of trying to create a new man, someone that will kill for you, which is what is happening here, because that's what Igor does. He has the monster kill for him. It's also the look of the film. The first two films are very, very Gothic. The third one is much more German expressionism. If you've seen movies, silent movies, like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and the Dr. Mabuse movies, you'll see a certain surrealism, the odd angles, the Dutch angles, the shadows, the way the shapes are. I'm not sure there's a single 90-degree angle in Son of Frankenstein.
Yeah, now that you mentioned that, I would never be able to specifically give you the terminology, but even as I watched this after Frankenstein, I could notice the difference in the way in which the camera was positioned. The last film didn't have any Dutch angles. I'm noticing the way in which the camera is framed around these characters. There was a lot more close-up shots and these tilted angles, which I was like, oh, okay, so they're definitely changing the style of filmmaking from the previous two movies.
Right, and you mentioned the close-ups. There are a lot of angles where they're looking up at the characters. You see these walls around them, these architectural support. You almost have ceilings in this movie, but you don't get ceilings until the next year when you have the Maltese Falcon and Citizen Kane used to give a closed-in feeling. Here they're dwarfed. But also there's what I call a German Nazi minimalist to the decor. One of the wildest scenes is where they're having breakfast and there is nothing else in this room except the table and chairs, and they're both overlooked by stair landings with boars' heads looking out over them. And it's hard to get more German expressionism than that. And whether intended or not, to me, this is all about Nazism is around the corner.
Right.
The attempt to create a super race.
Oh, wow. Well, that's definitely something I had, again, not considered before, but now that you've put that in my mind, looking back on the stuff that I've watched, I was just like, oh, wow. Yeah, I could definitely see it.
And they couldn't come out and say it. They would do it in metaphors, or they would slip things in that weren't obvious. And I think a return to German expressionism in this film is one of those things. Which of the movies is your favorite?
I had to wrestle with this for a little bit just because when I watched Frankenstein and then Bride of Frankenstein, I've been aware of Bride of Frankenstein's status in film history for a long time. I had a certain expectation going in. At first, after watching Bride of Frankenstein, I was still in the mindset that I still enjoyed the first one more. Just the idea of what it was going for. I think it felt like a simpler film. But then as I was thinking about it, I really appreciated what was happening with Bride of Frankenstein more. Some of the character conversations, the slightly larger scope, the music. One of my favorite elements is when Frankenstein runs into the blind man in the woods. They obviously form their friendship there. That was an interesting element to me because obviously we saw what happened with Maria beforehand. She unfortunately died. There was an interesting dynamic between these two where obviously Frankenstein couldn't speak at first, but he can see. And Frankenstein bonded with this guy because he not only showed him kindness, but couldn't fear him because he couldn't see him. And seeing how the blind man had helped Frankenstein understand words, speaking, and forming their little friendship before those two other guys passed by the house and then ruined everything. If they had allowed these two to stick together, maybe things would have worked out differently. Who's to say Frankenstein might have gone off the deep end eventually? I was really interested in that aspect, that with the religious elements that was incorporated in there, which was pretty surprising.
When it comes to religious elements, that caused a lot of problems with censors too. In the first movie, at one point, Victor Frankenstein says something like, "I know what it is to be God." And they cut that line for a long time. They didn't think they were ever going to find the line again, but they actually did find it, was able to return it. But that was considered blasphemy. And even for pre-code, that was a bit too much. But there was a lot of censorship issues with both films where scenes had to be cut and in order to play in various markets. The reasons why I think Bride of Frankenstein is most memorable are some of the reasons why you said it's bigger in scope. The monster has even shown a lot more empathy. And James Whale, when he was asked to do it, didn't really want to do it, but he agreed to do it if he had total artistic control.
Right.
So he was able to bring things to it that perhaps he wasn't able to bring in the first one. And one of those is a monster that is often more misunderstood or more sympathetic, because basically he's a child in a monster's body, which is probably the worst combination you could have. But in addition, besides having some of the blasphemy elements, such as Frankenstein overturning gravestones, and then when he is captured, where he's hoisted up on what looks like a cross.
Oh, yes.
That was much criticized at the time. And even now, you sort of go, oh, I get it. I see what's going on. But there's also the added element that some people think there is an undercurrent of commentary about homosexuality. James Whale was a gay director, about as open as she could be in Hollywood at the time. Colin Clive and then Ernest Thesiger, who are the main characters here, were both bisexual. Ernest Thesiger is obviously played as a gay stereotype. And the idea that he has managed to stop Victor Frankenstein from consummating the marriage, gotten him from his marriage bed to come and help him create this bride. And as some people said, what we have here is two men creating a child together. And leaving the woman out of it completely. You know, how much of this was intentional, how much of it we're just reading into it, it's hard to say. And speaking of that, there is a big change between the monster, between those two, and the third one. And the first two is a very sympathetic monster. He actually can learn to speak. He can do things like smoke, and he can think to some degree. But in the 1939 version, he's just a killing machine.
Yeah, as the film was going on and I realized that the monster had gone around and taken out all the people that Igor had on his, I guess, imaginary hit list, I was, good gravy, man. There's not really any good influences for the monster in this case. Igor is the only person that he's ever known and he feels attachment for. whenever Igor asks him to do something and he's playing his little flute. I wondered about that when I was watching the film, if the flute helped the Frankenstein monster do his killing, because obviously in the previous film we found out Frankenstein was quite partial to music. So I'm not sure if he had known about that and used that as an element to help him focus on his killings or not.
Music's very elemental. It has a great effect on people. With that, here's some more information about the film. One of the reasons why we have Son of Frankenstein, after a few years where these horror films generally weren't being made anymore, and one of the reasons I read is that in Europe they started to have a ban on horror films. So if you don't have the European market, there's no point in making these films. In 1937 or 38, there's a triple bill of Dracula, Frankenstein, and Son of Kong at Los Angeles' Regina Theater on Wilshire Boulevard, and it was a huge hit. So Universal reissued Frankenstein and Dracula on one program in theaters across the United States, and they decided to go back to making films, and they started with Son of Frankenstein. Son of Frankenstein was to be in color, but they couldn't get the makeup right. And I have seen some of the color shots of the monster, and yes, the makeup looks absolutely terrible. Frankenstein was made for $262,000, and it was a huge success. By 1953, it had made $12 million. Kenneth Strickfaden designed the electrical effects that were used in the creation scene, which is different from the book. In the book, it's chemicals that are used to bring the body to life. All of these scenes with the lightning, using the kites, were made especially for the movie. They've now become so iconic that most Frankenstein movies, if not all, always use this as the way to create the monster. The equipment used to produce them now has come to be referred to in fan circles as Strickfaden. And Strickfaden used at least one Tesla coil built by the inventor Nikola Tesla. You can also catch Walter Brennan and John Carradine in uncredited roles. I don't remember who Walter Brennan was. He's a peasant. But John Carradine I recognized instantly as one of the hunters that come into the blind man's house in Bride of Frankenstein.
Oh, okay.
Josephine Hutchinson, Frankenstein's wife and Son of Frankenstein, appeared as Mrs. Townsend in North by Northwest.
Oh, that's where I remember seeing her. I'm trying to remember for a second. Thank you for that.
Jack Pierce is the one responsible for the makeup for the monster, and he did a lot of the makeup for a lot of the monster movies at the time. The tiny mermaid in Dr. Praetorius's bottle was Josephine McKim. She was a member of the 1924 and 1928 U.S. Women's Olympic swim teams, and they all won gold medals in 1928. McKim was also Maureen O'Sullivan's body double in the nude swimming scene that previous year in Tarzan and His Mate. In closing out, is there anything else you might want to say about these movies or about Jurassic Park or about all the movies together?
In terms of the Frankenstein movies, watching these in succession for the first time definitely opened my eyes to this area of horror that I've never really dived into fully. I've always been aware of, obviously, the classic horror films and their place in cinema, but as a horror non-aficionado, I never delved into it until recent years. And to be able to see them for what they were, understanding the limitations of the time, there's a lot of really good dialogue. The performances is great. Again, the way in which these films look, they have a very specific style that makes them very distinctive and memorable. I just find them fun to watch. They're entertaining and they ask a lot of interesting questions of science, religion, and should not be created, and seeing the effects of scientists.
In closing out, I asked you to choose a film or two to go with your choice that might interest our audience.
This was a little more tricky for me, just because while there are certain films that have elements of Jurassic Park, there wasn't one that I could truly think of in the modern-ish era. So I decided to go with the film that preceded Jurassic Park in the form of Westworld. Because I ended up watching Westworld, I think, just prior to its TV adaptation a few years ago. And it was one of those films that I'd always been interested in watching because everyone said, oh, it's another Michael Crichton book. There are some interesting parallels between the films. Watching it for the first time, I was, wow, this really is just Jurassic Park before Jurassic Park, but with a very different kind of setting. The main enemy, instead of being killer dinosaurs, is killer robots. Having Yul Brynner in there in that role after having seen him in The Magnificent Seven, that was a surprise as well. It was a nice little switcheroo. I found that film equally interesting and entertaining. The format and the way in which things unfold is very similar to Jurassic Park. So if you can appreciate the limitations on this film, I would say give that one a watch. I find that film pretty good.
Excellent. I chose two films. They don't exactly deal with mad scientists, but they do have some similar plot points and ideas for the Frankenstein films. They are both silent films. The first is The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. This is a 1920 silent film. It's a German expressionistic nightmare in which a hypnotist uses a somnambulist to commit a series of murders. The other one is The Golem, which is also from 1920. It's a film based on Jewish folk legend. In 16th century Prague, a rabbi creates a golem, a large creature made from clay that he uses to seek revenge on those who have wronged him. But as in most revenge movies, things don't go quite according to plan. What is next? What should we be looking for from you?
I have two main episodes that I'm working on for my podcast. One is going to be the first in a series of episodes dedicated to video game film adaptations. That's a genre that a lot of people have said for the last few years could be the next big genre, like the current superhero boom that's going on. But I wanted to detail from the start which films worked, which ones didn't, and talk about the potential of the material that we have to work with, especially with the advances that technology has had in the video game industry in recent years. The next episode is going to be a roundup of the 2020 films that's come out on Netflix that I haven't got around to watching yet. So I'm going to dedicate an episode to 10 films that I haven't seen yet. Have a nice little binge in one episode.
That sounds great. What is the name of your blog again?
My blog is hypersonic55.wordpress.com. That's where I'll normally upload most forms of everything. I talk about films, TV shows, video games on there. That is an extension of my podcast, Film Focus.
Podcasts can be found on most streaming platforms.
Primarily on SoundCloud, iTunes, and Spotify at the moment.
Great. I'll run through my usual litany. I'm a screenwriter and script consultant. I have a Howard Kastner Facebook consultation page. I have a blog called Rantings and Ravings where I talk about issues concerning movies and screenwriting. I've published 2 books of short stories on Amazon, The Starving Artist and Other Stories, and The 5 Corporations and One True Religion. These are short stories that are horror, sci-fi, and fantasy. I have published the 2nd edition of a screenwriting book, More Rantings and Ravings of a Screenplay Reader, and I'm an amateur photographer, and you can find those photos on Instagram. The previous podcast was a Halloween-themed episode with blogger and horror film enthusiast Damian Riley, where we discussed Halloween 3, Season of the Witch, and The 5,000 Fingers of Dr. T, both about diabolical plots against children. The next episode will be with actors and TV radio show host Ralph Cole and Jasper Cole Jr., where we will discuss Bridesmaids and Monsoon Wedding, 2 films about events leading up to a wedding. With that, Curt, I want to once again thank you very much for being a guest on my show.
Thank you very much for the invitation. This has been fun. I have done a lot of learning, and it's just been fun to discuss these films that I have a new appreciation for. So thank you.